I never told him about the properties. Not once. And when everything fell apart 18 months after our wedding, that silence was the only thing standing between me and losing everything I had spent 23 years building on my own. I want to be clear about something before I get into all of it. I am not a suspicious person by nature. I spent most of my adult life giving people the benefit of the doubt, probably more than they deserved. I trusted my first husband completely, and he was a good man, a kind man. And when he passed from a sudden heart attack at 59, I was devastated in a way I still don't have the right words for. We had been together since our late 20s. I didn't know who I was without him. It took me 4 years before I even considered the idea of going on a date again. So when I say I chose not to tell my second husband about the rental properties, I need you to understand it wasn't because I was cold or calculated, or because I went into that marriage with bad intentions. It was because of a conversation I had with my solicitor the week before I agreed to start seeing someone seriously again. She sat across from me in her office on Wellington Street in Ottawa, and she said, "Judith, you have 3 properties that are paid off, you have a pension, and you have investments. Before you open your heart, make sure you've protected what your hands built." I respected her. I took her words seriously, and quietly, methodically, I did exactly that. I met him through a mutual friend at a dinner party in Kanata. I remember thinking he had a nice laugh. He was recently retired, a former project manager with the federal government, and he talked about his daughter like she hung the moon. He had been divorced for 11 years, which I thought was enough distance that there wouldn't be complicated feelings still rattling around. He seemed steady. He seemed honest. He was good company, and after years of eating dinner alone and watching the news by myself and going to bed in a house that felt too quiet, good company felt like a gift. His name was Gerald. His daughter's name was Tanya. I should have paid more attention to Tanya in the beginning, not because she was cruel to me at first. She wasn't, not openly, but because of the questions she asked. Not questions about me as a person, about what I liked or what I did or who I was. Questions about where I lived, whether I rented or owned, how long I had been in that neighborhood. The first time I met her was at a Sunday brunch Gerald hosted at his apartment in Nepean, and within 20 minutes she had asked me whether I was still working, what my pension situation looked like, and whether I had family I was close to. I told myself she was just making conversation. I told myself that some people are just direct. I told myself a lot of things I should have examined more carefully. What I told her was very little. I said I was comfortable. I said I kept busy. I said I had done some investing over the years and that I was grateful I didn't have to worry too much. I didn't mention the 3 properties. 2 of them were in Orleans, semi-detached houses I had purchased in 2009 and 2014, both fully paid off, both rented to long-term tenants who had been with me for years. The 3rd was a small commercial unit in Gloucester that I had bought with my own inheritance money after my mother passed, which had been leased to the same accounting firm for going on 8 years. None of it was flashy. None of it was the kind of wealth that would make the news. But it was mine, and it was solid, and it had taken enormous discipline and sacrifice and sleepless nights to build. I didn't lie to Gerald about it. That matters to me, and I want to say it plainly. I didn't tell him I was broke. I didn't invent a false picture of my finances. I simply didn't hand him the full picture. There's a difference, and I lived inside that difference every day of our courtship, and I made my peace with it. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. I said yes over dinner at a restaurant on Sparks Street, and I cried a little, and he cried a little, and it felt real. In the weeks before the wedding, I had a conversation with him, a serious adult conversation about keeping our finances largely separate. I told him I had worked hard for what I had, that I was proud of my independence, and that I wanted us to build a life together while each of us maintained our own foundation. He agreed without much resistance. I took that as a good sign. What I did not do, and what I now understand I should have done sooner, was run a full background check before things became serious. I want to say this directly because I know some of you are probably wondering the same thing. I should have done it. I knew such things existed. I knew there were services that could give you a clearer picture of someone's financial history, their debts, their patterns. I chose not to, partly because it felt clinical and cold and like something that would poison the tenderness of what we were building, and partly because I trusted my own read of the situation. I was wrong to skip it. I want to own that fully. After everything that happened, I hired someone to look into his background, and what came back was not criminal, but it was instructive. A pattern of financial dependence on women he had been with, an ex-girlfriend who had lent him a significant sum that was never repaid, a history of leaning on the people closest to him to smooth over the rough patches in his own life. Nothing I could have arrested him for. Everything I wish I had known before I signed a marriage certificate. But I didn't know it then, and so we got married on a Saturday in September at a small ceremony in Gatineau Park. 32 guests. My niece read a poem, and for about 3 months I was quietly, cautiously happy. The shift was so gradual, I almost didn't notice it at first. It started with comments about the house. I lived in a 4-bedroom house in Barrhaven that I had owned outright since 2017, the house where my first husband and I had raised our 2 sons, the house I had chosen to stay in after he died because I couldn't bear to leave the garden he had planted. Gerald moved in with me after the wedding, which made practical sense. His apartment lease was up, my house was large enough, and neither of us wanted to start completely fresh somewhere unfamiliar. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly he would begin to treat it as his own, in a way that had nothing to do with making it a home together. He started talking about renovations, a finished basement, a new deck, not as suggestions offered lightly the way a partner might say, "Wouldn't it be nice?" but as plans, specific plans, contractors he had spoken to, timelines. And every time I asked how he imagined we would fund these projects, he would wave his hand in that particular way he had and say something vague about figuring it out together, that it made sense to put some money into the house since we both lived there, that it was an investment. The house was in my name alone. I had made sure of that. It was not a marital asset because we had signed a cohabitation agreement before the wedding. My solicitor had insisted on it that specified each of us would retain ownership of assets brought into the marriage unless we agreed otherwise in writing. Gerald had signed it without complaint. At the time, I thought that was reassuring. Looking back, I think he simply hadn't finished reading the room yet. About 5 months into the marriage, Tanya came to visit for what she said was a long weekend. She stayed for 11 days. I want to be fair to her. She is not an unintelligent woman. She is careful. She watches. She asks questions that seem innocent and collects the answers and doesn't show you what she's building until she's ready. Over those 11 days, she took several long walks with her father in the neighborhood. She drove him to run errands. They had quiet conversations over coffee in the kitchen that would stop when I entered the room. Not abruptly, not rudely, but with a particular quality of conclusion that you notice even if you can't name it. After she left, Gerald started asking different questions. He asked whether I had ever thought about consolidating my assets into a joint account for simplicity. He said it would make things easier in terms of taxes. He asked if I had a financial planner, and when I said yes, he asked for her name because he'd been meaning to get some advice. I gave him the name of a different woman entirely, someone I knew slightly from my neighborhood association, not my actual planner. I don't fully know why I did it so quickly and so instinctively. Something had shifted in his questions. There was a direction to them that I didn't like. A pull. I said I would think about the joint account. I did not think about it. 2 weeks later, he told me over dinner that his daughter was having trouble with her rent, that her landlord had raised it and she was struggling to make ends meet, that he felt terrible about it and had been losing sleep. He didn't ask me directly. He never asked me directly. But the silence at the end of that conversation was a question in itself, and I sat inside it and said that it sounded very stressful and that I hoped things worked out for her. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said that he had thought, given my situation, that I might want to help. I asked what he meant by my situation. He said that he knew I was doing well, that he had gathered from things I had said here and there, that I had made some smart investments, that it wouldn't be a hardship. I told him I didn't know what investments he was referring to and that I lived on my pension and some modest savings. I kept my voice level. I kept my face neutral. And in my chest there was a feeling I can only describe as cold clarity, the kind that arrives when you finally understand exactly what kind of situation you are standing in. He dropped the subject, but he didn't drop it for long. Over the next 3 months, things moved in a way I can only call systematic. He started going through the mail more carefully. Our mail came to my house, which now meant his address, and while he had always been the one to collect it from the box, he began to open things before I got home from my Thursday book club. He would leave them resealed or loosely folded on the counter. I know he was opening them because I tested it twice. I marked envelopes from my property management company with a faint crease before I left the house, and both times they arrived on the counter without the crease, opened and reclosed. He asked about the letterhead on one of them, a property management company in Orleans. He said it had been delivered to our address by mistake, and asked if I knew anyone by that name. I said I didn't recognize it. I said it must be junk mail. That evening, I called my solicitor. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How quickly do you want to move?" I told her I wasn't ready to make any decisions yet. I told her I still didn't know for certain what the intention was. She said that was fine, but that I should begin documenting everything, every conversation, every unusual question, every piece of mail that had been opened. She also told me, and this is the part I want every woman who is listening to hear clearly, she told me to make absolutely sure that nothing had been signed, changed, or transferred without my knowledge. She walked me through every account, every title, every registered document. Everything was intact. Everything was still exactly where it should be. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. But it wasn't over. About a month after that conversation, Gerald came home one afternoon while I was in the garden and told me he had run into a man who worked in property investment, an acquaintance from his government days, someone who was apparently looking for partners in a development project in the valley. He said it sounded like a real opportunity. He said the man had asked specifically whether either of us had assets we might want to leverage. I put down my trowel. I looked at him. And I asked him very calmly where he had gotten the idea that we had assets to leverage. There was a beat, a very particular beat, the kind where someone recalibrates. He said he meant his own savings, of course, his RRSP, the small amount he had put aside. I said that sounded reasonable and that he should speak to a financial advisor before making any decisions like that, and I went back to the garden. I called my solicitor the next day. I told her I was ready to move. What followed was about 6 weeks of very careful, very quiet work on my end that my husband knew nothing about. I worked with my solicitor and my actual financial planner, not the neighbor I had sent him to formally document the ownership status of all 3 properties, to update and reinforce my will, and to consult with a family law specialist about what my exposure actually was under Ontario law. What I learned was reassuring because we had the cohabitation agreement, because my assets predated the marriage and had been specifically excluded, and because nothing had been transferred or commingled. I was protected, not perfectly, not without complexity, but protected in the ways that mattered. I also learned that my husband had approached my neighbor, the woman I'd given him as a fake planner, and had asked her pointed questions about whether she knew anything about my finances. She had called me, confused and a little alarmed, and I had thanked her and told her it was a misunderstanding. I hadn't told her the full truth. I told her later. I didn't confront Gerald. Not yet. I wanted the paperwork in order first. I wanted every door closed and locked before I said a word. When I finally sat down with him, it was a Thursday morning in February. His daughter was back in town. She had arrived the night before, which I suspected was not a coincidence. I told him that I was aware of what had been happening. I told him, plainly and without drama, that I knew about the opened mail, that I knew about the approach to my neighbor, that I knew about the conversation with the property investor. I told him I understood now what the question about the joint account had really been about, and what his vague references to my situation had really meant, and that I was disappointed, but that I was not surprised, and that I was not vulnerable. He started to say something about misunderstandings, about how I was reading things wrong, about how he had only ever been trying to build a life with me. I told him that I had 3 rental properties in my name, fully paid off, none of which were marital assets, all of which had been legally documented and protected before and during our marriage. I told him I had a solicitor who knew everything. I told him I had a team. The silence in the room was very long. He said he didn't know about the properties. I said I know. I won't tell you the marriage ended quietly, because it didn't. There were weeks of arguments, of his daughter calling me cold and calculating, of Gerald cycling between guilt and anger, and occasional attempts to reframe the whole thing as a communication breakdown between 2 people who loved each other. My sons were supportive, fiercely so. My younger one in particular, who had never entirely warmed to Gerald, said only, "I'm glad you handled it, Mum," and left it at that. My solicitor handled the separation agreement efficiently. Because I had protected my assets from the beginning, and because the cohabitation agreement was airtight, the process was painful, but not catastrophic. I kept the house in Barhaven, I kept the 2 properties in Orleans, and the commercial unit in Gloucester. I kept the garden my first husband planted. Tanya called me once after it was all finalized. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that was 2 minutes and 40 seconds long. I deleted it without listening to it all the way through. There is nothing she could have said that would have been worth my time. I've thought a lot in the months since about whether I made a mistake. Not in protecting myself. I have no doubt at all about that. I mean in choosing to marry him in the first place. Whether I was naive. Whether I should have seen it sooner. And the honest answer is yes. And also, I was human. I was a woman in my 60s who was lonely and who wanted a companion, and there is nothing shameful in that. What I would tell any woman in a similar position is this: you are allowed to want love. You are also allowed to protect what you built. Those 2 things are not in conflict with each other. They only feel that way because we have been taught our entire lives that protecting yourself is the same as not trusting, and that not trusting is the same as not loving. It isn't. The first thing I did before I ever let things get serious with any man again was hire someone to do a proper background check. I know that sounds clinical. I know it doesn't feel romantic. But I am 64 years old, I have worked for everything I own, and I am no longer willing to let the desire to seem trusting put everything I have at risk. You can be warm and open and still have your paperwork in order. You can love someone genuinely and still have a solicitor who knows your file. The deck Gerald had wanted to build on the back of my house, I built it myself the following summer with a contractor my son recommended and money from my own account. I put a small table out there and a chair with a cushion the color of moss, and in the mornings I take my coffee out and I sit in my garden, and I am genuinely, completely, quietly fine. I have my properties, I have my independence, and I have what my first husband always used to call the most important thing a person can carry. I know exactly where I stand. I still think about that Thursday morning in February, the light coming through the kitchen window, the way Gerald's face changed when I told him I knew exactly what had been happening. Not a dramatic collapse, not rage, just this quiet deflation, like air going out of something that had been held too tightly for too long. I've sat with that image a lot since then, and what I keep coming back to is this. What happened between us wasn't just about money. It was about character. His, mine, and the choices we each made when we thought no one was paying close enough attention. Gerald made his choices gradually, small ones at first. Opening mail that wasn't his, asking questions with a direction to them that he thought I wouldn't notice, steering conversations toward my finances with the patience of someone who believed, genuinely believed, that I was softer than I was. And Tanya made her choices too. 11 days in my house, walking through my neighborhood, building a picture of what I owned and how it might be reached. Neither of them did anything dramatic. That's the part people sometimes miss. Greed rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, in the form of reasonable-sounding questions and small tests and long silences that are really invitations. What I did, and I mean this without any self-congratulation, because I made plenty of mistakes along the way, was refuse to let comfort make me careless. I had worked for 23 years to build what I had: 2 houses in Orleans, a commercial unit in Gloucester, a home in Barhaven that held 20 years of my life inside its walls. None of it came easily. None of it came from luck. It came from discipline. From saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to things that would last. From getting up and going to work even in the years after my first husband died, when getting up at all felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. That kind of resilience, the kind that is built slowly, over years, out of actual difficulty, doesn't just leave you when someone tries to take advantage of you. It stays. It shows up in the moment you realize what's happening, and you don't panic. You simply act. And the doing the right thing, the genuinely honest thing, matters here too. I never lied to Gerald. I chose not to share the full picture, and there is a real difference between those two things. I had every right to protect assets I had built before he entered my life. Protecting yourself is not a betrayal of love. It is, in fact, one of the most responsible things a person can do when they are entering a serious commitment later in life. Because what you protect is not just your own security. It is your ability to remain a whole person, standing on your own ground, rather than someone who has handed themselves over entirely and is hoping for the best. The smartest thing I did was not keeping the secret. The smartest thing I did was build a team before I needed one. A solicitor who knew my file, a financial planner who understood my goals, and then trust that team when the moment arrived. Wisdom isn't what you figure out in a crisis. It's what you put in place before the crisis comes, on a quiet afternoon when nothing feels urgent and you do it anyway. I have my deck now, I have my garden, I have my coffee in the mornings and the sound of the city waking up and the particular peace of a person who knows with complete certainty exactly where she stands. That is not a small thing. That is everything.